it is a great pleasure to be part of this series, which I think has been fantastic. I really want to congratulate the Institute for everything that they've been doing to keep us ongoing with the activities of the Institute, and particularly also for inviting us from the law school to participate. We're very excited about the collaborations that we have with the Institute, and I hope this is just one of the many that we can organize in the incoming months. So today we're going to be talking about the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, which is called by most people as the USMCA. It changes the name. It's funny. It's one of those treaties that other countries decided to name it differently just because of nationalism views. So in Mexico, it's called the PEMEC, which puts Mexico first. And in Canada, it's the Canada-United States-Mexico agreement. So it puts the Canada first. But here it's called the USMCA and puts the US first. So how are we going to be proceeding with the presentation today? So the presentation today, the roadmap is, I'm going to be focusing mainly on US-Mexico relations and the exploration and production sector of the US-Mexico energy relations. And also I'm going to be particularly focusing on foreign investment protections. Why is this the case? Because foreign direct investment is one of the most important provisions when it comes to generating chains of value around the regions. Without providing enough protections to foreign investors, particularly in the energy sector, most of the cases investors are going to be reluctant to go outside and invest, particularly in countries that their judicial systems are not set up to process certain types of claims. So that's why I'm focusing on foreign direct investment protections. And also, it's also the other reason why I'm focusing to that is that it's one of the areas that changed the most compared from the NAFTA 1994 section. So the next, how we're going to organize the presentation is going to be, first we're going to be talking about the past. It's important to understand the past, to understand where Mexico is coming from compared to the US and Canada, and how it reached to further integration as Mexico opened up its energy sector in 2013. So the past is going to cover nationalism. It's a little bit about the history of nationalism in Mexico. It's going to cover a little bit about Mexico's energy reform of 2013. Then the presentation is going to go and move into the present. So I'm going to be talking about the USMCA, the actual treaty, what contains the treaty, the energy-related provisions in the treaty, the foreign direct investment provisions in the treaty, and the dispute resolution chapter in the treaty. That's the one that deals with foreign investment protection particularly. And I'm going to close the presentation with the current energy disputes, and particularly the ones that are arising in Mexico. As I go to the presentation, I might be jumping in and out on other topics that I think might be relevant for the audience today. But this is the roadmap for the presentation, and this is how we're going to structure the argument. So let's go back to the past. Why is the past so important to understand? It is important to understand the past because Mexico in 1938 was one of the first countries around the world to create a fully nationalized oil and gas system. What do I mean by this? In 1938, President Lázaro Cárdenas, the one who's in the picture, nationalized the oil industry all the way from production and exploration to midstream, refinery, retail, everything went into the hands of the state. And in order to be able for the state to exercise this monopoly over the sector, they created a national oil company. It was the first one of its kind because it was really in charge of again, the whole value chain of the industry. And the name of the company is PEMEX, and you might know about the company if you're related with the sector. So here you have some pictures of how the process happened. In Mexico was a very important event. For many years, it was a national holiday, the day that the national oil industry was, nationalized. And you see here how, for the Mexicans, it was a matter of pride. So it wasn't really just that they were against particular countries like the United States or the United Kingdom, which were the two biggest countries of origins of the company that were operating in Mexico back then, but it was really against an idea of imperialism. And so you see a sign there that says Mexico is a friend of the people of the United States, but is never going to be in favor of imperialism, international imperialism. So it was a way for the Mexican president also to rally nationalism around the oil industry and the state-owned company. And so in order to pay compensation to the companies, he actually asked money and donations from the population. So here you have pictures of a painting from a Mexican artist depicting how the Mexican population was actually donating, silver spoons, or they were donating their own cash, home or savings in order to pay for companies. So why is this important in context? Because think about it, from 1938 all the way to 2013, Mexico had a system where a single company was operating. That was PEMEX. Later on, it also extended to electricity production, and Mexico created two state-owned companies, CFE and Luz y Fuerza del Centro, that eventually disappeared. But CFE was the national one, also to produce electricity. So both production, exploration of hydrocarbons, refinery was all done by PEMEX, retail sale, the same with production, distribution of energy, electricity around Mexico was done by a state-owned company. And now we have a big jump to 1994. So 1994 is the year where finally Mexico, the United States, and Canada sat down and they realized they had to create an economic region in order to be able to compete with the incoming players from the European Union, from Asia. And so they signed the 1994 North American Free Trade Agreement with the idea that the three markets could compete better if they got integrated. Particularly for Mexico was a big push. It wasn't that Mexico and the US weren't sharing an enormous amount of trade. That was already happening. But it would really set up certain rules of the game for foreign investors, especially American investors, to go and invest in Mexico and develop more the national economy in Mexico. Now, one of the things that happened in the NAFTA 1994 for the purpose of this talk was that they excluded particularly the Mexican energy market. So back in the minds of the Mexican president of back then, President Carlos Salinas de Gortari, the Mexican population wasn't ready to give up the energy market to foreign investors. There wasn't enough political capital to push that through. So they decided to exclude the energy market from the treaty. The treaty also created, as I said, created investor protection section. So this basically was a mechanism for foreign investors doing investments in the three regions, but particularly, as you can imagine, in Mexico, to bring claims to international arbitral tribunals in case the governments breached the treaties. So Mexico, in order to receive foreign capital, they pledged to treat American investors in a fair and equitable way, in a non-discriminatory way, to give them full protection and security to their investments. And they would treat them the same as they would treat national companies from Mexico. So these were all principles set up in the 1994 treaty. In case Mexico breached those obligations, then foreign investors, especially American investors, could bring claims to international arbitral tribunals where they could allege the violation of the treaty, and then the tribunals could award monetary compensations that tended to be higher than the compensations they could get in domestic courts. And so the idea, again, was mainly for Mexico, but history told us that actually the mechanism was very effective also for Canadian investors when their rights were being violated in the United States. So it was a big switch. As we see the progression of NAFTA, we see that more claims started to emerge also against the United States, to a point where the United States was faced in the past from 1994 to today, around 16 investor arbitration claims against the actions taken by the US government. So far, the US government has won all of them, but the fact that suddenly the United States was being brought into court in international arbitral tribunals really changed the dynamic of the way the United States sees this type of dispute resolution mechanisms. In the case of Mexico, Mexico has faced 17 investment claims around NAFTA, and Canada has faced actually 26 investment claims. So the three nations have faced an enormous amount of claims for different actions, and this was, a big issue when the USMCA, as we will see in a couple of minutes, was negotiated. So after 1994, the NAFTA was signed, Mexico's economy started to grow, Mexico's consumption of energy also started to grow. But unfortunately, that was a couple of years later, Mexico's oil production started to reach a peak. So we see in these graphs how in Mexico from 1996, we see a rise of production, of general production in Mexico, even to a point in 2004 where we reached 3.5 billion barrels a day. And then the production started to decline to the point that in 2018, it reached 1.8. And then in 2019, we reached 1.67 billion barrels. So that's an enormous decline of production in Mexico. So Mexico was really facing problems in terms of its oil production in general. As you can see, also the reserves were starting to go down. So as the world, as you can imagine, the expansion of oil, the oil industry in the 2000s, the prices going up, As the world was expanding, Mexico production was going down, Mexican reserves were going down, to a point where in 2019 it reached the bottom of 7.9. Why was that happening in Mexico? Well, there are many reasons. One of the main reasons is that Pemex, again, had a monopoly. Most of its investments were done in production as opposed to having them in exploration. So basically, Pemex stopped exploring new fields. It was only investing in existing production, and that was maximizing the existing production, but they weren't reaching new investments, especially in offshore or in even shallow waters of the Gulf of Mexico. There were very few shallow waters. And also Pemex wasn't doing much fracking in Mexican territory. So you see here the main fields in Mexico. You see the evolution. Cantarell was the biggest one that was discovered in the 70s and really allowed Mexico to maintain production high. But as Cantarell reached a peak of production, most of Mexican oil production started to go down. And they weren't really able to supplement Cantarell with other fields. So one of the big things that Mexico did in 1996 was to start injecting nitrogen into Cantarell in order to increase production, but that also forced the field to decline in faster pace than they had expected. So that's why you see a huge decline of Mexican production in the late 1990s, early 2000s. Now, the same thing as I said before, one of the big issues comparing Pemex to PDVSA and Petrobras, you see also that Pemex was really financially not that bad because it was trying to increase production and selling as much as they could of the oil, but they weren't really investing in exploration. Now, the Mexican government, as you can see from this graph, most of the revenue generated by Pemex goes down the drain the moment you add all the fiscal responsibilities that the Mexican state imposed on Pemex. So this next graph, you see how once you add taxes, Pemex was really not financially viable. Right? All this production was being generated, was basically being taken over by the government. And that didn't allow also Pemex to use some of that revenue for new fields, for new boundaries and new exploration. So this led basically to the decline. So sadly enough, this was all happening at the same time that Mexican oil consumption was going up. Again, Mexican economy was expanding in the 90s. There was a growing middle class. And so you start seeing a lot of constraint on both sides, both more demand, but at the same time, less production from Pemex. The government also had to do some adjustments as the production was going down. As you can see from this graph, production was going down. So Mexican government had to start increase taxes in other sectors in order to maintain itself. Because at some point, Mexican government's budget relied around 40% of the government national revenue relied on Pemex and the production of energy. So when they realized Pemex wasn't going to be giving the same amount of oil, then they had to switch strategies. So by 2013, things were very bad in terms of production. The government's budget was really being affected. And the president of that time, Enrique Peña Nieto, was able to negotiate with the opposition a new energy reform. This was a really big change. Now, unfortunately, it is my opinion, it was too late. As you might recall, the prices of oil when they were in its highest in the 2007, 2009, Mexico was at that point losing productivity, so they weren't able to capitalize on the increase of prices. By 2013, the prices had already gone down again, and that's the moment when Mexico decided to open up the sector. One of the things they did when they opened up the sector is that they first allowed the state now not only to award entitlements to Pemex, but also to sign licenses, production sharings, and profit sharing agreements with private parties. This included also foreign investors. The next other big thing that they did, they opened up the monopoly of electricity production. So CFE, the state-owned company, was no longer the only producing party in Mexico. And in order to dispatch electricity around the grid, the principle that was set up in the energy reform was the principle of the lowest marginal cost. So this allowed the new players, if they were able to produce in a lower marginal cost, they would be dispatching first before CFE. Pemex also lost the retail market monopoly. So now you can buy gasoline at the retail level from other parties. So this also allows other parties to start importing gasoline into Mexico as opposed to before protecting the monopoly from Pemex. And finally, it created new independent agencies, and the ones that were created were given more independence in order to coordinate everything. So the National Energy Commission was strengthened. Also, the National Hydrocarbons Commission was strengthened. It was given more autonomy to do the bidding rounds. So most of the bidding rounds with private parties are done by an autonomous agency as opposed to being done by PEMEX or the Ministry of Energy. And then the other thing that they did, they created an environmental protection agency for the hydrocarbon sector to make sure that the environmental standards that were being implemented in Mexico suffice with the best standards around the world, as opposed to having to follow PEMEX old environmental standards. So this takes us to today. So where are things happening today, right before the USMCA? Was the energy reform successful or not? In general, yes, the reform was successful in attracting investment into Mexico. So as I said before, most of Pemex production back when the energy reform was happening was really mostly located inland and a few onshore fields, as you can see here from this map. This is where Cantarell was located, near the coast of Campeche. But the rest of the Gulf of Mexico wasn't really explored. And especially if you compare that to the US side of the Gulf, it's just really impressive how different they are. And just to give you an idea of the potential of Mexico's offshore production, this is actually what they're expecting Mexico's production to be like, which is closer to the United States. So the potential is there. With the energy reform, again, 111 production contracts were signed with different parties. This includes some licenses, production sharing, and profit sharing. And as you can see, most of them were done either independently, private parties, or in association with PEMEX. So the green ones were associations with PEMEX, or they were farm outs from PEMEX to private parties over here, okay? So again, well, 76 of them were licenses, 35 of them were production sharing agreements. 51 of them were inland, 28 were in deep water, and 32 were in shallow waters. So it was a very successful round of production. The other thing that the energy reform did, they reduced also the tax burden on Pemex. So you can see here in Pemex from 2013, this was the amount of taxes that Pemex was paying, then went down. They were able to reduce that to allow Pemex also to compete with private parties, because under the energy reform, when a bidding round comes along, Pemex competes just along with the other private parties. They have to present their own bidding round. They don't get any benefit for the fact that they are the state-owned companies. The state could still assign entitlements to Pemex if that was their decision, but they have to justify it under certain principles in the energy reform. They have to prove that Pemex is financially viable, technically viable, and that is the type of contract that maximizes recovery for the government. If you can't justify under those terms, then you will be in breach of the energy reform, and then the government will technically be forced to open a bidding round. Now, was that enough to increase Pemex production? Not really. As you can see here, again, from 2008, the declines there, it really stayed steady, but then keep declining, and now with COVID-19, it's even going steeper down. Now, private parties, on the contrary, have been able to be successful in creating more production. So this is the amount of production by the private parties in the different rounds. This is the open rounds, migration, and the farm outs. So production is still not to the levels where they can compete with Pemex when you see the overall Mexican production. Here right now, May 2020, we are around 1.5 billion barrels a day. Out of those, this lighter green are the ones produced by private parties, and this other green side, this is Pemex. So Pemex is still being the bigger producer. Private parties are starting to produce more. Remember, many of these projects are onshore, deep water. So it really takes a lot of years for them to start reaching a development. So a development stage. So still, we're not in a point where the private parties can brag too much about their production, but everybody in the industry understands that this is a long-term goal, and it shouldn't happen from one day to another. Many of these projects just started in 2015, 2016, and we're in 2020, in the middle of COVID, in the middle of the decline of price fall, so you can expect that. Now, Mexico's oil production was going on at the same time as we know that the United States production was going up. So this is one of the parallel stories. Mexico used to be a big exporter of oil to the United States, and now the United States is one of the biggest exporters of oil around the globe. Mexico still exports some oil to the United States, we can see here in the next graph, but it's not as much as it used to be. Actually, Canada today, it's a bigger exporter of oil to the United States than Mexico used to be. And also, when it comes to electricity, it is the same thing. Canada exports a lot of electricity to the United States. The United States also exports electricity to Mexico, but Mexico actually is a big importer of electricity. So this is just to give you an idea of the dynamics. How Mexico used to be the one exporting more energy products to the United States. Now it's actually Mexico who is importing a lot of energy products to the United States, especially now natural gas. Is the enormous amount of natural gas that Mexico is importing from the United States. And that is partly because during the energy reform, Mexico also migrated its electricity production to the use of LNG to produce electricity in Mexico as opposed to using coal or oil. And so, as you can imagine, at the same time that the fracking revolution was happening in the United States, a lot of gas was being produced and Mexico was requiring that gas. So most of that gas ended up being transferred into Mexico. So this new graph, this also gives you an idea. You see here how US imports from Mexico go down from 2005, 15 as the United States production goes up. But at the same time, US exports to Mexico start going up, especially when it comes to natural gas. And these are refined products, like crude oil that is required in Mexico to process its heavy sulfur oil, because most of Mexican oil is very sour. So we require a lot of petrochemicals that are imported from the United States. And also most of the gasoline that is being consumed in Mexico right now also comes from the United States, partly due to the fact that PEMEX was unable to keep up with its refinery capacities. Most of these refineries are operating around 30–40% capacity. So PEMEX made a decision a couple of years ago to buy 50% of the Deer Creek refinery in Houston in order to bring more gasoline into Mexico. So electricity flows, again, this is a big increase of electricity is going to from the United States to Mexico. And when it comes to gas, again, the biggest producers, look at this, this is an amazing graph, I love this. It gives you a broader sense of the amount of capacity that has been increasing from the energy reform to now, right? Most of that has to be with South Texas. So Texas is a big beneficiary of the trade with Mexico. And all of this is the total cross-border pipeline capacity. So what Mexico and the United States did after the energy reform, they started to build an enormous capacity to bring gas from Texas to the United States. So it was really beneficial in terms of trade for both parties. Mexico required the gas because there was a lot of electricity demand. At the same time, the US was had an oversupply of gas. So it was easier just to build the infrastructure. So you see all these are projects that have already been executed to bring gas from the United States. Some of them, the dotted lines are pending projects that we still don't know if they're going to be executed. Also, if you think about the infrastructure, most of Mexico's infrastructure, energy infrastructure, is located in the center, and the north, which is one of the ones that has been growing the most because of NAFTA, it requires most of the infrastructure that has been built on the US side. So this takes us to 2020, sorry, when the USMCA was being renegotiated. As you can imagine, the treaty was being negotiated being negotiated in 2017. The negotiations closed in 2018. If you think about it, this is right the moment in which Mexico's energy reform was starting to give results, right? So there was a big expectation that the USMCA was going to include an energy chapter in there to bring the NAFTA 1994 into the new reality, which was a dependency of both the United States, Mexico, and Canada on their resources. But in 2018, there was a presidential election in Mexico, and a new president came into power. So the treaty needed some revisions because the new administration wanted to put extra restrictions into the treaty that I'm going to go into detail in a minute. Especially the new administration from Andrés Manuel Lopez Obrador has a particular view about energy sovereignty. It hasn't really been defined what that means, but when you read his statements, what he basically wants to do is bring back Mexico into an era where the monopolies from CFE and PEMEX really had control of most of the production, both of hydrocarbons and electricity. That is his view. So energy sovereignty for the Mexican president doesn't necessarily mean energy independence in the sense of having also private producers producing in Mexico and not being dependent from foreign products. It really means giving control back to the state rather than making sure that Mexico is, as a nation, energy independent with the help of private companies. And that's an important distinction, because it is my view that Mexico could achieve some energy sovereignty and more independence with private parties, but it's a different ballgame to say that the biggest player should be the state-owned companies, especially considering the state in which they are right now. So the treaty finally entered into force in July 2020. So a couple of minutes right in the middle of COVID-19. And as you can imagine, that wasn't the most moment for the treaty to come into place. Both economy of Mexico, Canada, the three economies, Mexico, Canada, and the United States, were in halt because of COVID-19. So and people are still waiting to see what's going to happen with the pandemic before doing new investments. Due to Lopez Obrador's views, the energy chapter was taken off from the treaty. That was a big, in my view, that was a big mistake. They took it off, they scrapped it. They left some pieces where the United States and Canada signed a side letter containing some of the elements that used to be part of the energy chapter. There were still some advancements in terms of energy trade that the treaty had. So for example, in chapter 2, it updated the market access exception. So under the NAFTA 1994, Mexico reserved the right to grant import or export licenses for oil, petroleum, crude oil, petroleum products, natural gas. But now with the new chapter 2, basically the USMCA integrates the license requirements of the energy reform. So it makes it easier for, you still have to get a license requirement but, from the government, but the exceptions are lower than before. They are less discretionary. Also, I think another good thing that happened with the USMCA is that in Chapter 4, it modified the rules of origin. There was a big ask especially from the Canadian producers, because now it allows up to 40% of the volume of the crude to be non-originating. So you can use dilutants, you can mix it with lighter crude from different jurisdictions, and as long as it doesn't go over 40%, it will still be considered crude oil being produced in the region. And before that, it was harder for the Canadians, especially, to comply with the rule. And also the same with that is for refined products, it allows up to 25% of the refined product to be from non-originating in the region. So again, this allows more flexibility when it comes to mixing different crudes. Now, as opposed to have an energy chapter that recognizes the importance of the relationship, the USMCA, due to the complaints from President Lopez Obrador, included a Chapter 8, which basically states that it's a recognition of the Mexican state's direct, inalienable, and imprescriptible ownership of hydrocarbons. To me, this chapter is really a placebo chapter, because it really is not recognizing anything that international law already recognizes. That is basically every jurisdiction around the globe has the right to regulate their natural resources according to their own laws and constitutions. That is something that is recognized in the United Nations General Assembly resolutions and declarations, and it's part of customary international law. So there wasn't really a need to put it in the treaty, but it was important for the president of Mexico to say that Mexico reserved the right to regulate the industry under its own policies. Now, one of the things that it's important to notice about Chapter 8 is that even though it recognizes that right, it also recognizes that it should be done without prejudice to the rights and remedies available under this agreement to foreign investors. So this basically means that yes, Mexico can modify its laws, Mexico can have a constitution that is more restrictive, but it has to respect the rights and remedies available to foreign investors in this sector. So the next chapters actually reflect that. So chapter 14 that deals with investment recognizes that an investment that is as an investment, all concessions granted by governments. So concessions, licenses fall under the definition of investments of the treaty. One of the things that Chapter 14 did was to eliminate the Canadian and US dispute resolution mechanism. So basically, now Canadian and US investors that are doing investments in Canada and US can no longer bring claims against each other. This was a big change because, as I showed you before, there was a lot of claims brought by US investors in Canada against Canadian government actions. And there were also a lot of claims from Canadian investors in the US being brought by the US. So they scrapped that, they left it aside. They did leave a legacy claims for the 1994 treaty that would lapse for 3 years. And basically now the Chapter 14, what it says, it's only left for United States and Mexico investment. So Mexican, US investors doing investments in Mexico do have these remedies available. One of the things that they have to do is first they have to exhaust domestic remedies or attempt to exhaust them for 30 months, sorry. It limits the types of breaches that the investors can bring to international tribunals to direct expropriation, national treatment, and the most favored nation clause. So the limit is only to these three rights. They can no longer bring claims under full protection and security or minimum standard of treatment or indirect expropriation. It also clarifies what national treatment and most favored nation clauses mean. And this basically has to be in like circumstances as the one provided to other investors from other countries or from national investors. And it also, very importantly, includes an exception for public welfare objectives such as health, safety, and the environment. Now, and here comes the trick. Even though you have Chapter 14 for general investments, the negotiators also included an annex in that chapter particularly for government contracts awarded by the Mexican government. Right? And so this was a big win for the oil and gas companies and for the electricity companies that went down to Mexico during the energy reform, right? Because now they have their own dispute resolution mechanism set up for all those types of contracts, right? And it allows those companies to bring now claims under Chapter 14 to all the other rights that were excluded from the previous chapter. So they can also bring it for indirect expropriation. They can also bring it for performance requirements and for minimum standard of treatment. Another good thing for the companies, they took away the need to exhaust domestic remedies in the Mexican tribunal. So now they can bring them directly. They don't have to prove that they exhausted domestic remedies. And just in case there was any question whether these sectors were covered, they actually specified for the purpose of this annex what a covered government contract meant. And as you can see there in the subsection B, it specifically states that it covers oil, natural gas contracts for exploration, extraction, refining, transportation, distribution, or sale. The same with supply of power generation services and also telecommunications, which were the three biggest openings during the Peña Nieto administration, the previous administration in Mexico. And then just in case things weren't that clear that the oil and gas companies are covered by the USMCA, regardless of whatever Chapter 8 says, also in Article 32.11, the treaty specifies that Mexico cannot take more restrictive treatment that it awards to companies from other governments that are protected in other international treaties. And this basically means that they cannot adopt more restrictive measures. And what this basically makes is investors have to look at other international treaties that Mexico has signed to see whether it's giving more privileges to foreign investors from those countries. And when you look at other treaties Mexico has signed, the CPTPP includes the energy reform as part of the reservation. So this basically integrated into the treaty, the energy reform. So Mexico basically, unless they want to go into litigation, if they modify the rules of the game of the energy reform, they will have to compensate the investors because those investments are protected under the USMCA and also as reference to the CPTPP. So what is happening right now? AMLO's stated goals are basically the ones that have been publicly said: to avoid any rise of energy tariffs, to increase CFE's market share to 54% of power generation. So again, it's taking away the principle, as I said before, of the lowest marginal cost. So they're trying to force the regulatory energies to buy more from CFE. He wants to reduce dependency on imports of natural gas and refined products. Think about the graph that I just showed you about the amount of gas that is being imported from the US, the pipelines that are being built. Here they want to boost PEMEX oil output and refining capacity. They're actually building a new refinery in Dos Bocas, Tabasco that is going to cost $6 billion or even more, who knows. And that's going to also affect the amount of gasoline that is being imported from the United States. And they're starting to revisiting the energy contracts that, according to them, are not sufficiently beneficial to the states. So these concrete actions have taken the United States to complain. So many of the companies have been complaining, and they were able to convince members of Congress in just the past October to sign a letter asking President Trump to intervene on their behalf and to call the President of Mexico to tell him that the actions that they are taking against the energy companies is really affecting the ways and the rules of the game when they went down there to invest in the 2013 energy reform. President Trump hasn't said anything about it yet, but the ambassador of the United States in Mexico has explained and has expressed concerns about these actions. The President of Mexico reacted saying that it didn't really matter because under his view, Chapter 8 of the USMCA allows Mexico to exercise its own energy policy, and if they want to stay in Mexico, they will still have to comply with those rules. So I have just a couple of examples of concrete actions that could eventually be brought into international arbitration. So one was the forced renegotiation of the CFE of gas pipelines gas pipeline contracts that were signed with US companies. There was also the Ministry of Energy issued a decree favoring CFE over private producers for dispatch. So they took away the lowest marginal cost principle, and they are using a reliability criteria. Also, the President issued a memorandum to the regulatory agencies saying that they must give preference to PEMEX and CFE in future projects. There is also a permit paralysis in the National Regulatory Energy Commission that is preventing the international, the foreign investors to start producing energy in Mexico or to import material in order to produce energy in Mexico. There is also a proposal from the President's party in the Congress to amend again the Constitution and reinstate PEMEX and CFE's monopolies and actually resign existing contracts with private parties. And there are less controversial ones that, in the sense that I don't know if they could reach the level of international breach of the treaty, but PEMEX basically now was awarded 21 new entitlements without justifying them under the technical and financial capacity of PEMEX. And also the government canceled any new bidding rounds and farm outs for private parties. Okay, with that in mind, I'm sorry I took a little bit more time than I wanted, but I would love to hear your comments and questions and engage in a conversation with you. And thank you so much for being here.